Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
So today is July 4th, 2025.
Ah, yes.
Anything to be happy about this 4th of July?
Oh, there are small blessings in the life of
Any,
myself and my family, but I'm around the world. Anything to be happy about? The big, beautiful bill was passed. I don't know if we should be happy about that. Probably not. Really haven't been following domestic politics, but I'm sorry. I'm I'm not doing very well on the happy front.
okay, yeah, well, the big, beautiful bill, that's a big story. Another one is the U.S. stopping arms shipments to Ukraine. Where do you want to start?
Well, I think the arms shipments, that's really up our alley. That's probably
Okay,
should start with
so
that.
why is the U.S. doing this?
Well, the stated reason is that it's actually in the spirit of America first, and I think this is actually probably an accurate statement. Their stockpiles are running down, and they reached critical levels, and so they can no longer afford to spare these weapons, to send them to Ukraine. I'm sure that the recent Israeli conflict, Israel-Iran conflict figures into this, because of course Israel comes first. Israel gets what it wants, and their stockpiles clearly were drawn down very quickly. In this war against Iran. That's not true of all of clearly all of the munitions that are listed. For example, artillery shells are not something that the Israelis use, but they use these air-to-air missiles like the Hellfire missile, and of course, Patriot interceptors. At least in theory, they do have some Patriot batteries there, but there weren't any reports of the use of the Patriot. It seems like the Israelis have soured on that. So I think though Israel is an influence here, it's mainly just America's own needs, for its own security. There's just, according to guidelines, they should have a certain amount of these different kinds of munitions, and they were falling below those levels or about to, and so they cut off Ukraine. I think that's really what's it all. It's something that we've been forecasting and others have for a while. It's just the U.S. just does not have the productive capacity. They burn through their stockpiles at an alarming rate, and they're coming to the end of them.
Is it truly America first, though? I mean, or is it more Israeli first? If one of the reasons is to divert resources to the Middle East to protect Israel?
Well, it may be in some cases, but actually, again, like I was just saying, if you look at the list, a lot of those munitions aren't actually needed by the Israelis. Like artillery shells is just, again, one example. I don't think the Israelis use them at all. And then even though, interceptors at least could be used by the Israelis, I read many, many reports on, their Israeli air defense and the kind of interceptors that they were using and that the U.S. was using in defense of Israel, and I never saw Patriots listed. So, now the air-to-air, I think that's different. Like the Hellfire, I think those were being used to shoot down, let's say, for example, drones approaching from Iran.
Aren't those the Sidewinder missiles? Not Hellfire, right? Aren't those
I think you're
Sidewinders?
right, actually, the Sidewinder.
The
So I
Sidewinder,
don't even
yeah.
know, so it may not be, we're kind of assuming that, of course, as, people like to say, Israel's the wife and Ukraine's the mistress. And so, but I don't, again, these are not the munitions that Israel was using, by and large, in their conflict with Iran. So I think it really is about America's own needs and about just maintaining, their stockpiles for future contingencies.
Okay, so it was kind of a forced America first. It got so bad to the point where it's like, we just can't do this. Then we have to go back. I mean, America first would have
Yeah.
been never to get involved in these conflicts to begin with.
Yeah, right. It's exactly. But it's something I think probably the Biden administration would have gone ahead and sent these and may have even gone below the critical level. So there's a little bit of a difference in the way that the current administration prioritizes interests. But not. This is nothing. This is not a huge change. I think you're correct. Eventually, Biden would have to accept. The Pentagon would start squealing and say, "Hey, we've actually gone below our critical levels. We just can't do this," and he would have to stop. And these munitions, by the way, were munitions that were authorized for shipment to Ukraine under Biden. So we still haven't come to the end of what Biden committed to Ukraine. I think we're going to come to the end of it sometime this summer. That's what I've heard for a few months, and then we'll see what the current administration does.
Has something like this ever happened before to the United States military?
I can't think of it. I can't think of anything. There are past wars that, of course, consumed many more, or much more in the way of equipment and munitions. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, but our productive capacity was such that we could keep up with it. And I think that's the problem. It's just that this war is more than 3 years old, but we haven't ramped up our production with a minor, kind of a rather insignificant exception of artillery shells. And that's still way below what Ukraine needs. I think, we're down like below 20,000 a month at the start. Sometimes the Russians use that in a day. And now I think we temporarily got up to 40,000 and we've dropped back down to 30,000. We had the schedule, we're going to get to 100,000 by the end of the year or something. But we've already, the Pentagon has already admitted that we're not going to reach that objective. Even if we got to 100,000, we'd still really wouldn't be able to meet Ukraine's needs. So this is the problem. This is why, a real viable MIC, military-industrial complex, would be replenishing these stockpiles, as they were being used for, to support a proxy or something. But we just don't have that productive capacity anymore. And so that's why we're in this fix.
Are you surprised by the United States' inability to scale up? I mean, we've spent so much money on our military, and every year we're increasing it. Now it's over $1 trillion. Artillery shells, we can't increase the production. I mean, we've been using artillery shells since World War I. This isn't something that should be overly complex.
Right,
I know our Patriot interceptors, right, we make 550 a year. We're trying to boost it up to 650, which is still wildly inadequate, but we haven't been able to do it. It's kind of astonishing to me that, I maybe something like a Patriot interceptor, I understand it's maybe a bit more, it's much more complex than an artillery shell, but still, I'm a bit surprised. Are you?
Yeah, I am kind of surprised. Again, right, we have this huge military. If you look at, I think it was the Chinese that recently pointed out that 55% of military spending in the world is done by NATO countries. 55%. Russia, even though it has boosted its the spending on military matters, obviously because of the war, there's still just a tiny fraction of that, and yet as Mark Rutte himself has admitted, they're outproducing us. The Russians are outproducing all of NATO, 4-1, according to his statement. Maybe it's not that much, but it's clearly we are. They're suffering those shortages. They're increasing the amount of missiles and drones that they're using, and strike after strike. That's something that we can get into. I find it amazing, but it's clearly true. You just think about the huge amount of money that we spend. You would think that I think I had that assumption that we would have to have just this enormous military-industrial complex. But it's obviously, as we've said earlier, something not really geared to a war of attrition. It's just all these weapons are very expensive, and they're expensive intentionally. The more expensive you make a weapon under the current system, the more money you as an arms manufacturer make. It's not, this is obviously not in the interest of our military, but it's in the interest of our military contractors and of the the various lobbyists or the ex-generals and so on and so forth. And that's the system that we've made. And this whole system, this corrupt system that has developed over the past few decades, is going to have to be rooted out. We need to reestablish and build up a new system, but that's going to take plenty of time. I think it's everything from the ground up. We talk about the supply chains and the factories and the skilled workers. These are not things that happen overnight. It takes years and years, sometimes, a generation or two to really build these things up. But then just overall, the way that these contracts are assigned, there's clearly a very serious problem here. We know that there certainly was a great deal of corruption in the Russian military. That's become apparent because of a number of generals and have been arrested actually over the last several months in Russia. And it's corruption of the old-fashioned kind. Somebody is getting a kickback and then using that money to buy a huge dacha or something like that. But we have corruption in the U.S. It's on a grand scale, but it's institutionalized corruption. It's a whole system that enriches a lot of people and doesn't really meet real needs. That's corruption, but it's corruption within the law by and large. So we don't call it corruption. Now we got to, that corruption has to end if the U.S. is going to become, have a military that can actually wage a 21st century war against a peer adversary.
When did this corruption really take hold? Was it after the collapse of the Cold War? I mean, it felt like the U.S. had a lot of manufacturing might prior to that. During the Vietnam War, that was a long war. We were heavily involved in troops on the ground. We never had any issue with munitions or anything, as far as I know.
Yeah,
right?
At that time, the U.S. was still a great manufacturing power. So part of it, I think, is it just reflective of the decline in U.S. manufacturing, which really did peak in the 60s or early 70s, and then ever since then has been declining, as a share of our economy. Increasingly, manufacturing work has been outsourced overseas. Yes. So that's a big part of it. And then it's been a long time since we've fought a real war. Vietnam maybe is the last time where we fought a real war. We were, we had troops on the ground, and, but, since then it's been, Iraq. That's been the main, and this was really a very weak country, and or Serbia or whatever, just very small and relatively weak countries. They really couldn't fight back, and so it's been a long, long time since we've been tested in any significant way. You could easily say, almost, 50 years or longer, and so I think just naturally over a period like that, you begin to. And I think clearly the same thing has happened in Europe, and probably the process has been going on even longer. It's just that you stop to even think about the possibility of a war because it just seems so distant. And you just, naturally you just do the easy thing, and the easy thing is to enrich yourselves, and if you can set up a system which makes that fills a lot of pockets, and maybe produces a few razzle-dazzle kind of weapon systems, then everybody's happy, and why rock the boat? And now all of a sudden we're faced with the real possibility of, again, a war with a peer competitor, whether we're talking about China or we're talking about Russia. And it seems like, we should wake up. There should be calls, really shouts for, to change the system, to wake up to the new reality. But we're not hearing those shouts. We just aren't. It seems like we're still slumbering.
Yeah, what's so crazy is that this whole scam of the military-industrial complex, it didn't have to be exposed. It's being exposed because of our choices to get involved in these conflicts. Like, there's no real threat facing America. I mean, we got Canada above us, Mexico below, two giant oceans. We're very, very safe.
Right.
If we just produced our goods in just limited quantity and overcharge them, have a low supply, have scarcity of these super weapons, and there's not any major war out there that we're being involved in, then you could continue to, scam everybody by funneling these overpriced, over-engineered products that aren't able to be scaled up in production. But this was completely brought on by us. we are choosing to do this, this is I mean, what does this say about U.S. power if we have to announce to the world that, oops, sorry, Ukraine, you can't get any more. We're openly stating because we can't produce anything, and then at the same time we have a huge cohort in Washington D.C. It's like, all right, now we gotta take on China, contain China. It's like,
Right, yeah.
China's like, wait, what? And then the same thing with Iran. I mean, just the whole thing is, I mean, clearly this has to be a huge statement to the whole world that the U.S. is no longer the military superpower we thought it was, right?
Well, it should be. And I mean, there's, of course, many other things that have happened over the last few years that should reveal that fact to the world. And I'm sure the people that are really paying attention are noticing it, like ourselves. But a lot of people aren't paying close attention. And clearly, the political elites in the West, they really haven't woken up to the fact. I mean, they still seem to live in this world of unlimited Western power. And it's something that they just obviously have a great deal of trouble, abandoning. They just can't let it go. So, the plans that they draw up, the policies that they advocate, all are built on this assumption of unlimited Western, in particular, U.S. power. There's just no concern. When we had Joe Biden, he was asked this question, can we actually fight a war between, against all these different countries at the same time? And he said, you remember his answer, it was like, hey, we're the effing U.S. of A, of course we can. And
Come on, man.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the attitude. And that's why, I was just saying, why isn't somebody shouting, hey, wake up, we got a real problem here. We got to, we have a corrupt system that, is just inadequate for a real war. And there should be, alarm and measures to, all kinds of measures to radical measures to transform the system to something that can actually support a war. But we don't see it because, again, it's just, I think that smugness, that complacency, it's, even though the reality is starting to intrude, we see it intruding now with this recent decision to halt the flow of certain munitions to Ukraine. It's by and large the political elites and the people in general, because most people just trust what they're told by their political elites and what they learn on mainstream media. They still are living in the past, and they haven't woken up to the new reality.
Yeah, I think another big problem is that once you have a bureaucracy the size of the military-industrial complex, because that's really what it is. It's a bureaucracy now. I mean, it's a $1 trillion bureaucracy. There's no reforming that. It's gotten so big and so unwieldy that we see that we throw more and more money in it, and not even a drop is coming out at the other end. It's like, where is this going? It just seems like we aren't seeing the proper evolution in military technology that we should as a superpower. Hypersonic missiles is a perfect example. Like, why can't we build these things? Why does Iran have them? Why does North Korea have them? Why does China have them? Why does Russia have them? We can't do it. And just the production capacity. It just shows that, the more we put into this machine, it's too unwieldy now. It's too large. So there is no really reforming it, would you say?
Yeah, well, or any reforms are going to have to be radical. It means really, I think a reformer would have to take, it's more than reform. Yeah, it's a revolution has to be launched, within the MIC. Slash and burn tactics have to be employed. I think there's no question about it. There are so many, but the problem is, like you say, it's so large and unwieldy, this bureaucracy, this very comfortable relationship between the arms producers and the Pentagon, that there are many very wealthy and powerful people that have a great interest in maintaining the system as it is. And they don't want to hear about, some radical reforms and streamlining and, maybe producing weapons that have low profit margins, So they say, that's not why I got into this business, it's because of the huge profit margins. And they're going to fight it, and they do. So it seems like, yeah, we'll see. I mean, at some point you think there has to be a wake-up moment, but we're just not seeing it. I'm actually kind of amazed by it. Again, I assume that like after the war kicked off in Ukraine, that the West would start cranking up, its weapons production, and we're just not seeing it. It's just very, very minor. There's getting more and more talk about it, but it just like, especially in Europe, as the Europeans start to understand that they can't just rely on the Americans. But the Europeans are in an even weaker position. They're just, recently we know that Spain had resisted this call for increasing the military spending to 5% of GDP. And later, it was actually the Minister of Defense there explained why it wasn't. It's not just that it puts a real burden on the Spanish economy, but she said that this is because we just don't have that productive capacity. So it's just kind of nonsense. It's just these things again. These politicians live in this make-believe world. They can just spit out these numbers and then and maybe allocate a certain number of funds. I think it's even doubtful that they'll be able to do it. But if you don't have the factories on the ground, if you don't have the supply chains, and they're not even anywhere close. I don't think any of them seem to understand it. They're just living in the past, a sense of superiority that of course we can do what we want to do. It's all just a matter of will. It's just sort of everything is ideological. It's just a question of, are you going to be committed to this or not? It's just not, they're not interested in the nuts and bolts reality, but the nuts and bolts reality in the end is going to determine the outcomes.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I didn't really think about that. When these countries are going to boost their spending, it's like, okay, all right, now you have more money to spend on the weapons. But the problem is we don't have the weapons. So you're just going to increase the price of all these weapons. It's like, okay, good. Everybody's now, instead of spending 10 million on artillery shells, we'll spend 20 million for the same number of artillery shells, because we don't have any.
Yeah. Well, that's true throughout the political, let's say, it's kind of a truism of political economy. I mean, you find this again and again. And to take a very different kind of example, education. You always have politicians bragging, I spent so much on education. And it's just like that becomes a measure of their commitment and their concern and their support. $100 million. That's how much I love education, how much it matters. But then you look at the results 10 years down the line, and test scores don't go up at all. It's just that, but they're not even concerned about that. They've already, they've labeled themselves, I'm the education candidate. Well, it's the same thing, when it comes to the military. I'm not saying that military and education are the same things, but the attitude, the kind of rhetoric that is used is we spent $50 billion on this. You say, well, yeah, okay, but what were the results? A lot of politicians never seem to get beyond their own statements and their own, the targets that they've set. Their targets weren't actually, they should be real life targets. Like, we're going to produce so many tanks, so many, maybe it's not a good idea to produce tanks these days, but so many missiles or whatever. But they don't say that. They just give a number. And maybe they'll achieve that number. But as you said, that means just maybe the same number of munitions at higher prices.
Yeah, the problem is it's all monopoly money. Like I think that's the fundamental problem with the United States. It is this fiat dollar system where we can just constantly print money to fund everything. And the big beautiful bill is what going to potentially is raising the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. We're already at $37 trillion. And just these numbers are just all just kind of made up. And it's just this belief in the system that's keeping it together. But at some point, it's gotten nobody's even talking about trying to reduce the debt anymore. Other than Thomas Massey, Elon Musk is making some noise about it. But it's clearly gotten to this point where everybody knows it's a huge problem. But the attitude is just, let's just don't talk about it and hope nothing happens while I'm alive.
Yeah.
And that's right. The policy, but it's gotten so big. Right. I'm trying to remember what it was when I was a little kid, but I mean, we weren't even at like 10 trillion when I was in like high school or something like this. And now we're
No,
at
I don't think you were
37
even
trillion.
close. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it was like, I mean, when did we break? We won't have to get into
Yeah.
it, but
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah,
anyways,
no,
it's
really,
out of control.
Right. It really has exploded in recent years. And yeah, like you say, it's gotten so huge that nobody can deal with it. So they just pretend that it doesn't exist. It's like the so-called elephant in the room, and the elephant gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and just everybody's playing this game where they're pretending that they don't know this is, massive African bull elephant, that's standing in the back of the room and is beginning to make noises and stomp its huge feet. But anyway, that's it.
Yeah,
and it would be comical and it is kind of comical, but the consequences are going to be huge.
Well, I mean, the African bull elephant's going to take the building down at some point, right? Is it going to happen? It'll happen probably all at once, right? Once there'll be this crisis moment. I mean, we're already seeing the strains and the cracks, and we cut Russia off of the U.S. financial system, and Russia's doing great.
Yeah.
China, I think China is going to be the catalyst. Or I don't know, maybe just something will just implode here. If somebody,
Yeah, it's
an
very hard to
emperor.
predict those things. It can be it would probably be some kind of event again that nobody can foresee, but it'll have a domino effect, and then one after another, all these pillars of the economy will fall. It could be any time. It could be tomorrow. There is a kind of a deadline looming 8 years from now. In 2033, the Social Security Trust Fund is going to run dry. And that's going to have huge consequences. And the debt will be so many trillions, and that will further accelerate. At that point, like to maintain Social Security, either the government is going to have to greatly increase the amount of money that it prints or greatly increase taxes. And so there's going to be an economic shock at that point. Now, it may be that we don't make it through 8 years. I think there's a very good chance, but that is sort of a hard limit that, that's one clock that is ticking, if by some miracle that the economy holds together by then, I doubt that it's going to be able to survive the end of Social Security as it now exists.
Do you think that this open admission that the United States military is unable to produce munitions at a sufficient capacity will be eroding confidence in the U.S. dollar in general? Because that was always one of the arguments that I heard, is like, well, why does everybody use dollar? Okay, we have the global financial system we set up, but it's backed by the United States military in large part. Like, we are the power, so this is it. But if we're kind of openly admitting that, oh, sorry, we don't have that our power is not as great as we thought it was, will that just be another weight on the dollar?
Yeah, right. I think all of these, we talk about the three pillars, they're mutually reinforcing. So when one of them is weakened, they're all weakened to some extent. Yeah, this is not a particularly huge event, but it's just, well, I guess it is if you look at it closely. It's the first time we have an admission of this. I think it's just like we knew this was coming, so I wasn't particularly surprised when the statement was made. I think that Biden might have gone a little farther, but eventually, or Kamala Harris, they just would have had to say the same thing at some point. It's just a reality. So anyway, yeah, it is. It is just the reality has just been further exposed by this incident, and it does call into question U.S. military power. There are many things that have happened over the last few years that really should call that into question. The Ukrainians in particular seem to be shocked by it. Again, they really shouldn't, but I think they just had this faith, as part of the fix that they got into is, everything from Maidan to the decision to tear up or withdraw from the Istanbul agreement. It's just that, well, we've got the U.S. at our backs, and the U.S. is all powerful. We all know that, and so you just can't go wrong by trusting in the U.S. This is the kind of thinking. And I think they simply assumed, like when they decided to to abandon negotiations and to go all out and attempt to defeat Russia. Well, so we can because we've got the world's greatest power, and there's just no limits here. We'll just like they say, as long as it takes, and so we're going to do it. Now they found out that as long as it takes, that was a lie. It wasn't built on reality. That statement, as long as it takes, is based on the idea that there are no limits to American power. So we'll just do it until we win. Well, you've gone 3 years and you're running out, and that's the reality that the Ukrainians, in particular, are waking up to right now. But now they're turning to the Europeans, and the Europeans seem to think, that because they live in the same sort of ideological bubble. Well, it's just that it's a matter of will for us. We just have to will 5%, and we'll do it, and we're committing $100 billion. All these politicians, but it doesn't change the reality, and the Ukrainians are going to learn that the hard way. They are learning it now the hard way.
How big of a blow is this for Ukraine's military?
Yeah, well, they're in real trouble, especially when it comes to air defense. There was a massive attack last night, and there have been many very large-scale attacks. That's one thing, we've talked about what's happening on the front, and the Russians continue to advance, but it's still in this lava flow fashion. They are making important gains, but there's nothing very dramatic happening there. They're steadily winning, there's no question about it, but at the same kind of slow, steady pace. But what has really changed over the last month or two is the air raids. And that may be a function of different things. The Russians frame them as a response to terrorist attacks. I don't know if that's really true. I think maybe they were going to do it anyway, because when you look at what they attack, they're generally military-industrial facilities. But they're attacking them in a big way now, and Ukrainian air defense is just nowhere to be seen. Especially, I think last night they said the people who looked at all the video footage of the massive attacks on Kiev last night in the Kiev area said they could not see a single interceptor go up. They were using some of their like anti-aircraft guns, firing essentially large bullets, shells into the sky, and I think man pads, and that was it, just to take out some drones. But they could do nothing. They had nothing for the missiles and nothing for the great majority of drones. So they're just completely exposed and all across the country. They have this desperate need. You've been hearing Zelensky, begging for interceptors from the Europeans, from the Americans, and they're just not coming. And the answer is, why is that? It's because they just don't have them. We knew that even before this conflict began. Like there was. I remember reading stories about the limited production capabilities of the U.S. when it came to interceptors. You mentioned it was 550, and they're trying to pump it up to 650, but they seem to be having trouble doing that. So they were always in rather short supply. Now, the U.S. managed to bend some elbows and get different, countries around the world to give up some of their interceptors and some of their, Patriot systems. But those have been used up, and a lot of those systems have been destroyed by the Russians, and there's just nothing left. And you can just see it now. So it is it's having a huge consequence already. Just the fact that now they know they're not going to get replacements. I think they were being, they were getting the cold shoulder, but now it's, official. No, you're just not getting them. And the reason is we just don't have any to spare.
Are we seeing any admissions from the Pentagon or DC saying that maybe we are just way too overstretched, that the empire has gotten too large, that maybe we need to bring things home? Or is it more instead, we just have to focus, divide and conquer. We got to focus on China now, or we got to focus on Iran.
Well, that's unfortunate. That is in a sense, an admission of our limits. that we have to focus on something. Like under Biden and Blinken, it was just like we take on the whole world at the same time. There was just no admission of any limits. So it is, in a way, it is a step in the direction of realism. I think there, in particular, there's Eldridge Colby, I think that's his name in the Pentagon, he's a China hawk, and he really does want to wind down the conflict in Ukraine because he sees that it's just burning up our military assets, and he wants them for China. But yeah, come on now, it's just like again, if you, it is more realistic than again the previous administration. But it's still, I think, it's still a version of American hegemony, and so I don't know that we have anybody saying, hey, time to end the empire. Again, you just have maybe Thomas Massey. It's the kind of thing that Ron Paul always said, but we're not hearing that, from any significant power holding individual now.
Yeah, it seems like, if you're in the establishment, you have to pick one. You have to choose, are you a Russia hawk, Iran hawk, or China hawk? Are there anybody that's just like, hey, maybe we don't need to do any of these things? These places are all on the opposite side of the world from America. How is this in the best interest of Americans here? Maybe we could focus on, I don't know, maybe stopping drugs coming in from the cartels through the southern border. That makes more sense. This is our border. This is our country. Why do you have to, if you want to be in U.S. politics or within the U.S. military-industrial complex, you have to be a hawk on one of these three?
Yeah, right. Well, again, I guess it's just part of it's American exceptionalism, and that's part of our political DNA now. It's just that
exceptionally stupid, though, right? That's what it is. It's
well, again, you could get it with something that we could get away with for a long time, especially during the 90s, the unipolar moment, and into the early 2000s. It's something that we could get away with, because we were the hyperpower, but those days are over. Amazingly, you are getting, again, we do get statements coming out of the current administration from people like Marco Rubio sometimes, an admission of that. So but when you look at policy, that's maybe that's the one thing you can point to is like, well, they seem to think they've come to recognize that we can't attack all three of these so-called enemy powers at the same time. But what you end up is with, well, we go after two of the three, or the realists say, we focus on the largest one out of the three. But as you say, nobody is really, I think really has come to grips with the full reality.
Well, okay, if we take a look at sort of these three theaters, China, Iran, and Russia, as U.S. politicians hawks against. Is there an issue between Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel that are all vying for, choose me, America, send me all your weapons, all this, or, is Ukraine now, are they pretty pissed at Israel? Because it's like, hey, no, you guys settle your own thing. We need America's help here. Because now everybody, there are these three theaters, and they're all vying for U.S. support, U.S. military support. Well, Taiwan is not really. It's split.
Well, they're getting a lot. It's something that does not in the news because it's not a hot conflict, but we are pumping a lot of weapons into Taiwan and have made a lot, some major commitments recently. As far as Ukraine, I'm sure that the mistress has to be very jealous of the wife, if you want to put it that way, but she doesn't go out and say it. In fact, whenever Zelensky always makes an extra effort to applaud Israel and whatever it does, and clearly and denounce Iran and all that to show that he's on board with that, but he secretly has to be fuming. He doesn't want cross or anger anybody in the U.S. political establishment. And probably the quickest way to do that is to actually criticize or attack Israel in any meaningful, in any significant way. So he's very careful not to do that. But I think they probably understand what's going on, and they're just, but what can they do about it? It's just that, so all he can do is continue to beg.
Do you think that China is making some big moves based on these recent events in terms of just like, okay, we are done with the United States? They saw how the U.S. dealt with Iran with these negotiations. They've been seeing this Ukraine war unfold for 3 years. They see us pumping money and weapons into Taiwan. They saw the trade war that was waged against them. A lot has happened in the past couple of years. And, China really is the biggest player on the planet, in terms of industrial capacity, population, just weight that it can throw around. Do you see it making some big moves? Or is it already making big moves behind in the shadows and they're just slow, so we're not really seeing it?
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's in the shadows. I really don't know about it. It's clear that over the last several years, China has, I think, woken up to the reality. Again, like Russia itself, right up until the SMO, still had hopes of achieving some sort of modus vivendi with the West. And China, I think, continued to do that even after the launch of the SMO. But to all appearances, they have abandoned that just because of continuing hostility and increasing hostility by the Americans against China. And of course, they saw what happened in Iran, and Iran has actually been a pretty close ally, a very important country to them, source of oil, and Russia is very, very important to them too. It was just the other day, it may have been yesterday, that I believe it was the deputy foreign minister, it might have been the foreign minister, Wang Yi, I'm not quite sure, that told Kaya Kallas that we can't let Russia lose. We're not supporting them actively, but we can't let them lose because we know what you want to do. And then that's just obvious. If you're always talking about this pivot of Asia, or the China hawks, they know that these China hawks exist within the U.S. administration, and they know that they want to pivot away from Ukraine and then go after China. So it's clearly in their interest to support Russia, to make sure that Russia's not going to lose, and of course they're not going to lose. But that that Russia emerged victorious, and I think the same goes for Iran. I mean, it just so if there's something happening in the shadows, it probably concerns support, especially for Iran. China has supported Iran in the shadows in the past. I was just reading about the nuclear program. They provided them with uranium, a great deal of it, actually, which was completely legal. That has to be emphasized. This wasn't some sort of secret or illegal operation on the part of the Chinese or or the Iranians. The reason it was done in the shadows, it was not just the uranium, but various kinds of equipment too that was used in Iran's completely legal nuclear program. But they did it because of the hostility of the U.S. They did it secretly because of the hostility of the U.S. The U.S. was actually violating the NPT, trying to prevent Iran from getting completely legal equipment and to develop a completely legal enrichment capability. So the Chinese back then felt, okay, we're gonna help Iran, but we're gonna do it secretly, and because we don't want to deal with the hostile U.S. And eventually, it was the program was exposed. So I'm not surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the way China's going about it. They're not going to announce what they're doing, for example, to support Iran, and probably they're supporting Russia's in ways that are not announced. They're they're careful, they're cautious. They know the U.S. They understand that the U.S. is a hostile power, and that's why, you know, part of the reason they're going to support these other countries. But they don't want to increase that hostility in the short run and suffer any sort of consequences. So they do these things in the shadows, you know, just to you don't want to enrage the giant. He may be, you know, he may be a dying giant, but he still can lash out and do you damage.
Have we always had this hostility towards China, Iran, and Russia? It feels like maybe it's just because I wasn't aware, but growing up, I just never felt like that we had, you know, this wasn't a thing, you know, that, or maybe it's just because I'm talking about it and I wasn't aware, but I just didn't feel like, I was like, China is like, yeah, we trade, you know, presidents would meet with Putin or with Hu Jintao or whoever, you know, and it wasn't,
right.
I just felt like there was, and in that sense, it was good for us economically, but also just their soft power in these countries. There was a positive view of the United States. I mean, I remember when I was living in China, I talk taxi drivers. They're like, "Oh, you're American?" They're like, "Yeah, America number one. We love America," you know. And by the time I left China, that wasn't happening anymore. You know, that was over. Right. So it's just like, well, why? You know.
Yeah.
Why did we choose to change our posture, you know, just so openly towards them?
Well, in the case of Iran, actually, the hostility has been there ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. That has been ongoing, you know, and is, has not been interrupted in any significant way, you know, ever since 1979. Everything was great when it was the Shah, you know. But when the Shah was overthrown, he was our guy, and then we've never forgiven them for that. And, you know, and for the hostage crisis, too, back in 1979 into 1980. But, yeah, in the case of Russia, well, certainly, you know, I remember the Cold War years, and the Soviet Union was the great enemy. But there was never the hatred, I think, of the Soviet Union that you find now among people, even the political elite. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was, you know, was a very greatly diminished power and really subservient to us and our interests during the 1990s when Russia was led by Boris Yeltsin. There was no talk, you know, Russia was defanged, you know, there was more jokes about Russia than anything. There wasn't any hatred or fear of Russia. And the hostility towards Russia began after Putin took power, and he began to, I think, just step by step restore sovereignty to Russia. And that's something that we really, you know, began to see that, okay, they're no longer subordinate to us. So then the old fears of Russia began to arise, and the hostility, you know, with it. And that has just increased steadily since the early 2000s, you know, gradually at first, but it was there. I remember reading articles way back in even the early 2000s about disturbing trends in Russia. And the disturbing trends really, I mean, it was a lot of nonsense. The Russians, life in Russia was getting better for the first time in 10 years after the horror, the collapse of the 1990s. The Russians were starting to hope again. But from like a neocon perspective, oh, this is disturbing. The Russians are actually starting to stand up again. And that continued, and then it was was it in 2008 that Putin gave a speech? I think it was at a Munich Security Conference, where he said, "Look, it's just this hegemonic thinking really has to end," and that infuriated a lot of people, and the political elites in the West. And then it just went on from there to where we are now, and I don't think I need to repeat all the events, which I think are very well known to all our viewers right now. Now, in the case of China, I think I mentioned maybe in the last program, it's like when China first came in, from the cold, after it began its launched its policies of reforms and opening up, as the literal translation of the Chinese under Deng Xiaoping in the early 1980s. There was a very positive view of China. We saw them as a potential partner. And I think that thinking was that they're on their way to becoming Americans. They're going to adopt our system. They're taking the first steps in that direction, and they're just going to. We're seeing a process of Westernization, and I think that like what's happened, especially, but even earlier, I guess, but especially under Xi Jinping, is that it became clear to us that no, actually, this is not a process of Westernization. China is becoming its own place, and like Russia, it stands on its own 2 feet and pursues its own interests. It's not going to subordinate its interests to our interests, and that's something that became obvious over time. But especially, I think prior to Xi Jinping, they were on that trajectory, but especially under Xi Jinping, it's become clear. So, yeah, now, we can't tolerate other centers of power. We can't tolerate a multipolar world. We still cling to that unipolar world that we achieved in the 1990s, and we can't let go of that. Or I shouldn't say we again. The political elite.
Yeah, but I mean, with Russia, when you're saying that it started to regain its sovereignty in the the 90s and early 2000s, prior to the Munich Security Conference in 2008, that Russia was geared towards the West. There was talk of Putin was wanting to even be part of NATO. Imagine what the world would be like now if we allowed that to happen. But it seems like there was this resistance to even let Russia be part of the West, even as a lesser party in this group. I mean, maybe closer to a peer, but there was a clear willingness from Russia to be integrated into the Western system. But we just rebuffed them. We rejected it. It was like we didn't. I don't know what was the goal. I mean, it's like they were saying we want to be part of your club, part of your team. We said, we'll just make you an enemy instead. Like what is the strategic thinking behind that?
Well, I think maybe we can look at two different but maybe parallel points of view, or let's say motivations. One is the pure, the cold geopolitical calculation, and that is that Russia, quite simply, is a great power. Maybe it wasn't a great power in the 1990s, but they could see that it would become a great power again, and as such, and one that is no longer willing to subordinate its interests to the West. It becomes a rival, and it becomes too big. And this is something that, again, in the thinking of these people, is that we can't accept it. Now, they're looking to cooperate with us, but that's not what we wanted. Clearly cooperation, that's different, because when you truly cooperate with a rival power, you're admitting that you're not the sole power. And it's just sort of something in their thinking that they could not accept. It was subordination, or, it seems madness, but look, that's what we're seeing all around the world. If you don't subordinate your interests to us, you are the enemy. If you're not with us, you're against us, as George W. Bush said. And I think that's the thinking. Like, the question of NATO in the early 2000s, Putin even brought it up. And but I think they understood if Russia was in NATO, then we would no longer have the kind of control over NATO that we once had. There's a potential that there would be another voice. And, as things are, the U.S. completely dominates NATO. NATO is entirely just sort of a mechanism for the exercise of U.S. power, you could say. And if Russia was just too big a country to swallow. I think they understood that even if Russia was not hostile, it would just become, it would cease to be what NATO really was supposed to be, and that is this mechanism for the exercise of U.S. power. So that's the kind of the cold geopolitical calculation that I think you found, and maybe explains this growing hostility over time. I mean, at some point it becomes irrational. It may have some sort of rational basis, but it becomes irrational. I mean, at the end, it's like, well, this is reality. Why can't we just live with other powers? The world has done this before. We can learn to. The Cold War, we We actually, the Soviet Union was hostile to us. This is a country that's trying to cooperate with us, and it was much more powerful. But we found ways to get along and to avoid war, right? So why can't we do that? But I think it's something changed in the thinking of Western political elites, especially U.S. political elites in the 1990s, where they adopted this new mindset again of U.S. hegemony, and that simply cannot admit a rival sovereign power. Now, but then there's also, I think, just an inveterate, visceral Russia hatred on the part of other political elites in the West, and you find it in the U.S. and it's something that that existed all along, and it's something again that Jeffrey Sachs has commented on, that he noticed the difference in the way that the U.S. establishment responded to his requests, for economic aid. When it was Poland or some other Eastern European country, the aid came immediately. When it was Russia, it didn't come. And he just learned that there were people who just hated Russia. And it's just, maybe it's just kind of the after effects, or it's just residual anti-Soviet hatred that is just kind of morphed into anti-Russia hatred. Or maybe it's something else. It could be the certain Jewish individuals have this historical memory of the pogroms or whatever. I don't know. It could be many different possibilities, but there is that irrational, Russian hatred, anti-Russian hatred. So, and again, yeah, I think in the end it is irrational, and a realism would admit that this is a sovereign power that has its interests, and its interests need to be respected. Again, as John Mearsheimer argues very forcefully and effectively, but we refuse to be realistic about it. We're ideological, and this ideology is just, is at its root irrational.
Well, it's scary. It's driving us to the brink, this irrationality. But is there any meaningful diplomacy that we are engaging in that reflects on realism when it comes to China, Iran, Russia? I mean, under Biden, we didn't have any communication with Russia. Right. And when our communication with China was simply reprimanding him. Here under Trump, we have some communication. I think we had another phone call. I think it was his 6th phone call with Putin.
Right.
But I don't know if these mean anything. Is this meaningful? Yeah. Because if we're just regurgitating, General Kellogg's points, it's like, well, you're not being realistic. You're not recognizing the facts on the ground.
Right. Well, though we have, in essence, in effect, recognized some of the facts on the ground. This recent freeze on the supply of munitions to Ukraine is a recognition of the facts on the ground. I guess. It's actually been very minimal. It's good that we've talked. There has been an improvement in tone. We don't get the same kind of hostile, the statements against Russia that we heard quite regularly under Biden and from Biden himself. It seems clear to me that Trump doesn't hate Russia the way that Biden did and Lincoln did. But, when you look at substantive policy, other than this very recent freeze, and again, it's really quite limited. The rest of we continue to cooperate with Ukraine in providing intelligence, which is again huge, and the satellite systems supporting their communications, and these are probably even more meaningful than the supply of munitions in general. And then we've just only frozen a fraction of the munitions that are going to them. So the policy really has changed very, very little. I think that we have to admit. Now, there haven't been any new sanctions, to my knowledge, that we've slapped on them, but neither have the old ones been been reversed. There have been certain moves. Let's say I think there was some sort of commission to investigate so-called Russian war crimes, and we pulled out of that. So there have been, and there have been votes in the United Nations. You look at the statements from like the G7 and NATO, and they're much less hostile to Russia than they were in the past. Again, this is in the area of rhetoric, and it's more symbolic than anything. But when it comes to substantive policy, we're not seeing significant changes. We're going to come. There'll be a moment of truth later this summer when all of those Biden weapons actually do run out, and what will happen then? Are we going to just turn on open up the pipeline again and send them more? Is a new bill going to be passed, or is there going to be a new arrangement where for example, the Ukrainians buy our weapons using European money? There's some talk of doing that. We'll see, but will it, really meaningfully affect the overall support that Ukraine is receiving from us? That still remains to be seen.
Is there any type of diplomacy going on between Israel and the United States and Iran, or is there just no communication now that Iran is? I mean, Iran just got red weddinged,
right.
So,
yeah. Well, I hear different things. Like I heard that actually maybe Witkoff and Arakchi, the Iran's foreign minister, are going to meet in the near future. But that I think was a story leaked by, that was reported by Axios. And whether or not that's true, I don't know. It seems like actually the Americans really want to negotiate with Iran. I think they're kind of worried about where this is all headed, but the Iranians are showing very little interest for obvious reasons. I don't think we really need to explain why. And in general, this is what I think it was The Economist recently reported, that there has been a seismic shift in the political landscape within Iran away from the moderates into the hardliners. And the hardliners are actually, during the war, the supreme leader Khamenei ceded a fair amount of power to the hardliners in the IRGC. And, the hardliners are saying enough is enough. And he says basically everybody is becoming a hardliner, even the former moderates and reformers, even the anti-regime people in Iran are becoming hardliners because of the viciousness of this attack by Israel. So anyway, they're just not interested in talking to the U.S. Maybe they will, but maybe they're going to do it in their own red-wedding fashion, meaning like, we'll just string them along while we develop a nuclear weapon or something. Who knows?
So I was going to say, when you say hardliners, what does that mean? Does that mean that there's going to be, a pursuit of a nuke, or a potential that Iran may be the one that will start this thing up again? It doesn't seem like their MO. Iran always waits till they get hit, and then they do something, and then
right.
But it just feels like, is that a good policy? Are you just going to sit around until Israel and the U.S. are going to do this again? I mean, how many times has Israel attacked you? It's just over the past year. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah. No, I've thought about that too, because the country that launches a surprise attack does have an advantage, and could Iran do that? I guess they could. I mean, that is dangerous because it could galvanize the U.S. to come in immediately on Israel's side. Like in this case, it was so obviously launched by Israel. Maybe our establishment doesn't really need an excuse and doesn't care a whole lot about popular support. But the popular support for even our intervention was shaky. It was there, but it was shaky. And and I think in part because this so obviously was initiated by Israel. But if Iran initiated it, even if they had a good reason, finally we're striking back after, your nasty surprise attacks on us. I think there would be much more popular support for an American intervention, and the Iranians understand that. So they're probably going to be reluctant, even the hardliners would be reluctant to do that. But yeah, it's a question of a nuclear weapon. They may be going for it now. Who knows? Who knows what decisions have been made. Now, it's interesting. A lot of people kind of poo-poo the fatwa that Khamenei issued, against nuclear weapons, and it's been in effect. And but it's for real. That fatwa really means something to them. There was a fatwa against the use of chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq war. Again, where Iraq with Western support attacked Iran in the early years of the Islamic Republic, and they began using chemical weapons, against Iran. They killed 20,000 Iranians outright with these chemical weapons, and then well over 100,000 were injured. Some of them, even to this day, are suffering from the effects of it. They really suffered, and they were the victims of of the use of weapons of mass destruction, of these chemical weapons. And they complained about it. They tried to bring it to the attention. There was just no concern within the U.S., of course, or the U.S. and the West in general just continued to support Iraq, and they didn't do anything to prevent them from using chemical weapons. And there were Iranian generals that complained too, and said that we need to have some chemical weapons, at least as a deterrent, so that these attacks don't continue. But the supreme leader at the time, who was Khomeini, refused. He said, "This is haram. This is forbidden by Islam." And that's so. I mean, this was. I think it shows that fatwa is for real. It really meant something. So I don't know. It may be that you have a lot of hardliners that really want to do this in Iran right now. I think that's probably true. But Khamenei may hold his ground and insist on the fatwa. And it's amazing. It's actually I think we have to respect Iran as actually being a moral power. Just in a way that so few countries are these days. So we don't know if they're going for it or not. I think the pressure probably is huge, and they may indeed go for it, but who knows?
Yeah, I mean, a fatwa seems to be much more trustworthy, much more binding than any document that you sign with the United States or the Western world. Those aren't even worth the paper they're written on. They seem to always be rules. We break those willy-nilly. But when I hear that fatwa, it seems like you said, Iran is very principled, kind of showing itself as a moral power, which is, I think, huge. And they are operating with a lot of honor and integrity. But the problem is that, okay, I mad respect that the integrity of the Iranians and their sense of honor. They don't engage in deceptions and lies the way that the West does. But you are dealing with a power where that's all they do: terrorism, deceptions, lies, bribery, assassinations, whatever it is. So, as you don't want to become the villain when fighting a villain. But at the same time, you have to operate under the sense like, okay, we have a humane sense of morality, of our integrity, but we're dealing with an opponent that has none of these things. So what do we do? If they're going to be engaged in this type of behavior, we can't let them take advantage of our integrity, of our honor.
Yeah, no, it's a. I don't really have the answer to that question. I think that's probably what's being debated right now within Iran. How can we, remain a moral power? But we also have to be realistic. You can, if you're too idealistic, well, the end result may be that you cease to exist. That your people are enslaved. That many people are killed. So you do have to be realistic, and you do have to have a real deterrent when you're dealing with somebody like this. So somebody who doesn't have a sense of honor. The only thing that person is going to respect is your power, right? So they may say, well, we thought we had a sufficient deterrent with our missile systems, and I think we deterred them to some effect. But I think maybe that's not enough. Maybe, again, I think this is maybe the argument that's being made. The only way to really deter them is to have a nuclear weapon. I don't know. That's
Can Khamenei can he lift the fatwa in secret, or is this something that is public? Because if he says his fatwa has been lifted, then everyone's like, okay, well now we know what's going on.
Yeah, right.
So I mean, clearly they're not.
Yeah. Right. I don't know. Actually, I don't know. The Iranian political system is very complicated, and I'm not sure. That's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Iran, as sometimes, this is maybe the Westernist in me saying, like, you're being too honorable, like they're always doing these sneak attacks on your country. They're always attacking, it's like, I don't want Iran to stoop to that level. But, it's just, you want to see them persevere. But I think the end result is the fact that they have, acted with so much restraint, with so much honor, and with a real moral compass, is that they are getting more and more support. I mean, most people didn't even really know anything about Iran back in the day. It's just like, okay, there is, some beef there. They're the bad guys, fundamentalists, Shia Islam. It's like, but you didn't really think about it that much. But now Iran has become popular. It's like, okay, this is a moral power. This is a real, and I think that in itself is just earth shattering around the world, because there's been so much effort to portray, Muslims in Iran in particular, as just sort of these, as terrorists, as bad people. And then the whole thing has just been turned on its head now. And everybody's realizing, wait, everything you told us about the Middle East has been a lie. Everything has been a lie. And Iran's not these are good people that are trying to do what's in the best interest of their countries. Sure. I mean, talk about them being fundamentalist, religious, fanatics. I mean, you see Ted Cruz saying, well, it says in the Bible we have to honor the state of Israel because Genesis was talking about the 1948 government formed by the secular Zionists. It's like, what are we talking about? Who is the fundamental religious fanatic here,
Right, yeah. Well, again, you hear about the crazy mullahs and whatever. I've heard about that ever since 1979. But you look at the actual policies that Iran has pursued, vis-a-vis its enemies, and they've shown a great deal of restraint. They have been on the receiving end of attack after attack, beginning with the war launched against them by Iraq with Western support, and, with using extensive use that involved in extensive use of chemical weapons. They were on the receiving end of that, They're supposedly the mad mullahs. The mad mullahs you think would respond in kind, but they didn't. They actually continued to suffer these attacks and never, went to use of. They could have very easily developed chemical weapons. They had actually a very advanced chemical industry, but they never went down that path. They never even took a step in that direction. Who are the mad mullahs? And then, there have been all the kinds of the economic sanctions, and then the really extreme provocations, and then the vicious attack on them by Israel. And the only time where they finally responded was after that mass, after Operation Rising Lion, where so many of their leaders were assassinated, and civilian nuclear scientists, and so many civilians were killed, and their whole country was under attack. Well, then they responded. That was it. After you could easily say, better than 46 years of extreme provocations. Yeah, so who are the mad mullahs? The mad mullahs seem to me to be, well, in Israel and the U.S., as you say.
Right. Yeah, right. Well, I don't know if we have time for this. I wanted to bring up something that I've been wondering about. I'll just bring it up with you, and we can maybe discuss it later. But I feel like there's a concerted effort going on online now to kind of pit the Western world against Islam, against Muslims, that this is the great battle, Christians versus Jews, and Christians versus the evil Muslim hordes. And I'm wondering, is this like a state-sponsored plan, that this is an idea that we got to divide and make the enemy, Muslims. And I understand, that if you're, and I think it's a good plan for the bad guys if you want to do this, because I understand where they're coming from because of all of the wars that we have started in the Middle East, all of the death and destruction we wrought upon these countries. It's caused a huge refugee crisis and, around the world. And most of them go to places like Europe. And so, Europe is losing its sort of original national identity. You used to go to, to Malmo in Sweden, and it would be all Swedish, and now it's the makeup is changing, and I think that's causing some resentment. And there's this idea that, okay, we can play on this, and this is what we need to do. We need to make it so it's not our fault. It's the Muslims are the enemy, and that's why Israel's the good guy. They're fighting all these evil Muslims that are coming here, invading your country and taking your homes and whatever it is. That's roughly the large sort of narrative that's being pushed out there, I feel.
Yeah. Well, I think that narrative has been out there, for a long time. And, especially after 9/11, but even before that, it's been there. And I think in the past, actually, like 10, 15 years ago, it was much more powerful than it is now. But it still exists. And I understand if you don't really know much of anything about other countries, but you see these, these communities, these foreign people taking over neighborhoods that used to, maybe where your friend lived or whatever, and a lot of them seem to be hostile to your own culture. Yeah, you're gonna look at them as invaders, and then you're gonna extrapolate from this experience and think Muslims are Muslims, without any understanding the difference between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. And then within Sunni Islam, there are actually many different, let's say, streams of Sunni Islam. There's Sufi. There are many Sunni Islam Muslims are Sufis, and that's a very different kind of understanding and practice of Islam than the Salafist and Takfiri varieties. But people don't know that. They just don't. And apparently many of our political leaders. So it's a very kind of convenient, lazy sort of explanation. And yeah, people of, who have their own axis to grind, like the Zionists, take advantage of that. And for their own purposes. It has nothing to do with, their attack on Iran. It has zero to do with it. There are very, very few Iranian refugees in Europe, and most of them that are there are actually very highly educated. And same thing in the U.S. So this has nothing to do with maybe unpleasant experiences or of domestic terrorism in places like Europe, but. I'm sure the Israelis understand that, and other people that have nefarious plans against Iran, for example, they know that, but they also know that the average person doesn't know that, and so they use this ignorance to their advantage. I think there's no question about it.
Right. We spend all this time, the West spends all this time vilifying Russia, but really Russia should be looked at as the example for us to show how Christianity and Islam can coexist harmoniously. I mean, I think this is one country that we can see where you have a very strong Christian identity, but also a very sovereign sort of Muslim identity within Russia that is very loyal to the state of Russia. That, the Chechens are very martial people, and they seem to be very devoted to Putin and defending Mother Russia. So it just like this is, I think it's an example. We don't talk about that much. I don't think people really think about that. I know prior Chechnya was a huge problem for Russia. Yeah. Probably was that funded by the CIA, Mossad? Probably. Right?
Yeah. There was clearly there was CIA.
Of course it was. Of course it was.
Right.
Well, I didn't even ask.
Right, and in general, in the Caucasus, there was CIA involvement. That's something that Putin complained about directly to, I think, Clinton and Bush, and he said the response is like, "Oh, I didn't know about that," and maybe they didn't. It's just something that the deep state was doing. But yeah, there was involvement. There's no question about it. You don't want to idealize it, but all in all, what you say is true. There have been frictions between the Muslim communities, and sometimes we still get terrorist attacks. But the worst ones, like the Crocus City Hall massacre, was actually from the Tajikis. They weren't Russians. The difference is that these people consider themselves to be Russian, and that they're the Muslims in Russia, by and large, the vast majority are patriotic Russian citizens. Their Russian identity is very important to them. And I know that Putin has commented on that directly too. He said that's the difference. Like when Western Europe, these are recent arrivals, people that, fleeing wars that were often initiated or exacerbated by the West. They come to Western countries. They have hostile attitudes towards the West. They're not assimilated. And so then the West has a real problem. They have these angry communities within their borders, and that's the real problem. But he says, look, like our Muslims have been part of Russia, for, in many cases, hundreds of years, and they're Russians. And so that's something that makes, possible to have this harmony. Sometimes the harmony can break down on the edges, but all in all, it seems, it's very impressive. Like, I think in the most recent presidential election, the single highest percentage in favor of Putin was actually in Chechnya.
Yeah. Don't mess with the Chechens. That's they're tough people there. Okay, Dad. Well, I think we can end it there.
Sure.
All right. Tomorrow we'll do another episode, though, a members only video. So anybody that's listened all the way to the end, if you're interested in becoming a member, you just click join below. It's $2.99 a month, and my dad and I will do an extra episode on the first Saturday of every month. I'm thinking I brought up this topic with you. I'm thinking of discussing just capitalism in the United States and what the end result is. Like, should we be blaming capitalism for what we have now, the lobbies influencing our government? And, we're seeing, I want to touch on, the rise of someone like Zoran Mondani as well. And just we'll dive into it. We'll see. I'm sure it'll be an interesting conversation.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dad. I'll probably see you later. We should do something for the 4th.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I forgot.
Okay.
Almost forgot. I forgot about it until at the end of the day yesterday. I was like, oh man, because I heard some fireworks. I was like, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Happy 4th of July.
Happy 4th, everybody. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.